My name's Adam Davis. I'm with Oregon Humanities, and we have been running a series on making democracy for many months now, thinking about different aspects of democracy over the long term, thinking about justice in the courts, democracy in the internet, voting, equality, holding office. This evening, we're going to be thinking about safety, justice, and policing. And we're very lucky to have with us to do this Nkenge Harmon Johnson, Samuel Sinyangwe, and Omar El Akkad will be moderating the conversation. We're going to go for about an hour with the three of them, and then we're going to shift to about a 30-minute breakout conversation for all of you who are watching and listening. We're going to break into small groups, give you a few questions to follow up. So we're really looking forward to that and hope that you will participate in that as well as listen to what Samuel, Nkenge, and Omar have to say. I want to just mention that I'm welcoming you from downtown Portland, a few blocks from the, I guess, the center of a lot of activity and a lot of national coverage. The topic we have in front of us tonight is both to say it's timely would be a huge understatement. Also to say that it's been an ongoing set of tension and questions for many, many, many years would also be an understatement. And so we're really pleased to be able to dig into it a little bit tonight. And we imagine that many of you have a lot of feelings and thoughts and questions about this. And so hoping to make time for those after as well. I want to thank you many of you for writing in with questions beforehand. And we will follow up with you after as well. I do want to say a couple thanks before passing the screen on to Omar and Nkenge and Samuel. First, I want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Kinsman Foundation, Tonkin Torp, Stoll Reeves LLP, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and Pulitzer Prizes, all of whom have helped make this and lots of other events possible. I think what I want to do, in lieu of asking audience members questions, which I would do if we were in person, is let you know that there are certain advantages to being online. As far as we know, there are Oregonians from at least 21 counties around the state piping in for this evening. And Omar, Nkenge, and Sam calling in from different places. Nkenge Harmon Johnson, I'm going to say welcome, even though I can't see you on my screen yet, the president and CEO of the Urban League of Portland. Samuel Sinyangwe, the creator of Police Scorecard and Mapping Police Violence. And moderating the conversation, Omar El Akkad, a journalist who covered Black Lives Matter movement in Ferguson, Arab Spring, Guantanamo Bay events, and also has written a novel that if you haven't yet read called American War, I hope you will read it soon. We are delighted that the three of you are here. And Omar, Nkenge, Samuel, handing it off to you to get us into all this. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. It is a real privilege to be here and to be moderating this conversation between two people who have done a lot of vital, difficult, and overwhelmingly thankless work to make this country a better place. It's an honor to be a small part of this. In the summer of 1982, my father was walking home from work in Cairo in Egypt. He worked at a hotel downtown. He was an accountant. And at the time, Cairo, Egypt entirely was under martial law. It still is to a certain extent, but there was a curfew. And the curfew extended to almost everybody, unless you had a permit from the state. You couldn't be outside at night. And if anyone's been to Egypt, they know that everybody comes out only at night. But nonetheless, officially, you couldn't be. And so my father had a permit because he worked in the tourism industry. And he was walking home one night and a military van pulled up next to him. And a soldier got out and said, "Show me your papers." And so he did. And the soldier immediately took the papers, tore them up and said, "Show me your papers." And it became clear what was about to happen. And it just so happened at that point that my father's boss was also walking home and happened to know that soldier's father. And so the situation was dissolved. My father was not grabbed and taken into the van. But I remember him telling me this story many years later, and it has become sort of my default for when I consider a society to be slipping into a particularly fascist kind of rot. This moment where it's really life or death vital for certain individuals to obey every law, no matter how arbitrary, and entirely inconsequential for the state to do the same. And so I want to start with you, Nkenge, because, not far from where I live, the streets of Portland right now, there are unmarked vans in which federal officials in the costume of soldiers effectively are snatching people off the streets. And I want to ask you first off, what have the last few days been like? And also, what is it like to see this situation when you are advocating for specifically, police justice and a fundamentally different version of policing, to see the response after 50 some days of local police violence in response to now see it at the federal level as well?
First, I want to say good evening. Hi, Omar. Hi, Adam. Hi, Sam. And to the audience watching, I'm really glad to be here. And Omar, thank you for sharing that your story. Thank you for sharing your dad's story. It sets a good tone for our conversation this evening. It's interesting because most of Portland, most of all of the cities where we're seeing protests happening right now, most of those cities are quiet, right? There isn't much happening across town. There are some, marches or protests that happen in different parks and different neighborhoods. But what people are seeing on their televisions and what they're hearing on the radio and certainly in the national news is downtown Portland after about 10 o'clock, right? So the national news isn't showing the protest and the march that's happening at 7 p.m. They're not showing the protests and the march that are happening at 5 p.m. They're showing the police violence that starts at dark, which is at about 10 p.m. It feels, for me, I'm of a couple of minds, Omar. One, in some ways, it's great that the police have revealed themselves to be who we have long known them to be. One of the challenges that we face when we're trying to do police reform and now talking about how to defund the police are that many people in Portland and for that matter across the country, particularly middle-class white folks, don't understand really how vicious the police are in our communities. So they don't understand when we're saying the police do these terrible things to communities. They over-police Black men and boys. They treat Black and brown women differently than they treat white women. Folks don't tend to see that. And in a city as white as Portland, that makes a big difference. So when the mayor is getting calls from folks, he often hears from people who never really interact with the police. Their last interaction was when they were a kid with Officer Friendly. So they don't understand that the police are capable of the kind of violence that they're exhibiting in the streets every night. So on the one hand, thank you, officers, for demonstrating who in fact you really are on a day-to-day basis so that our community can see you. So that as we're trying to make a change, the argument isn't quite so difficult because they've made the best argument for us about why the police department needs to be different. And in fact, perhaps we don't need to have it at all if this is the way that they're going to treat members of our community. On the other hand, it's devastating, Omar. Looking at the way neighbors, friends, my employees, community members, the way we're being treated as we, express ourselves, use our First Amendment right. It's outrageous, it's unacceptable. And the fact that we now have feds in our streets, you can see that thousands more Oregonians are in the streets, not just in Portland, but they're in Salem and they're in Eugene. And I think there's some protests that are gonna happen in Southern Oregon, just in solidarity with folks in Portland. I know people in Seattle are in solidarity with folks in Portland and they're demonstrating. It's outrageous and it's shocking. And I really wish that we weren't at this moment in time.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's you're getting at something that has been, one of the many things that's been deeply infuriating to me is this notion of the narrative and the silos of narrative in this country, wherein you can watch the acting head of the Department of Homeland Security describe the town I live in as some kind of lawless, the purge type situation, and knowing the reality of that, clashing with that narrative. And Samuel, I wanted to ask you about this because you are a data scientist. You spend a lot of your time looking at numbers, looking at patterns. And one of the things that astounds me about the makeup of this country, particularly as it relates to policing issues, is the number of layers of jurisdiction. You might have sheriff, county, state, local, federal, the federal troop officers in Portland through Department of Homeland Security, but also subset ICE or the border protection. How difficult is it on a practical level to get anything like holistic data about what a police force is doing and what the impact is on the community?
So it's really, really tough. And this is the jurisdiction issue that you spoke to is one of the reasons that's very tough. So even basic things like sheriff's departments that contract with cities to provide law enforcement in that city. So for example, in many places, and I know this happens very frequently in California, especially with the LA Sheriff's Department, actually, they operate the Compton police station. They operate a range of different police stations across the LA County area. Just to better understand what those jurisdictional boundaries are, which cities have a sheriff's department that is providing the primary sort of policing in that area versus another department. All of that is very hard to do across the country. There's not like a national uniform database that determines what the roles of each police agency are, how they all interact, who takes certain types of calls. So if you have a hostage crisis situation or something, oftentimes in a city, they will have the sheriff's department respond to that with a SWAT team or some militarized policing, problematic policing unit. And just which places have that response versus having the local police department respond versus doing what in some places do, which is sending a mental health provider to respond. Just knowing which places do what and to what extent is extremely difficult. And there's no sort of nationwide database to determine that. Now, that is one issue. The other issue is a lot of what the police do, they simply don't record, they don't track. If they do track it, they delete or purge the records of what they do. There are many, many police departments across the country that don't report every time that they use force, for example. Oakland, there was just an investigation in Oakland that officers were routinely not reporting when they point firearms at people. And the way that they figured that out is they had to get access to all of this dash and body camera footage. They had to go through all of the video and figure out, were the police reporting what they were actually doing on the video? And it turns out, of course, they weren't reporting it. If they don't report it, it means it can't be investigated. If it's not investigated, can't result in any type of accountability. So from a data perspective, there's just so much information that we still don't have because it's either not being tracked by the police, not being tracked by the federal government, and or if it's being tracked in the police union contract in many places. Actually, we did an investigation of 81 of the 100 largest cities in the country. In the majority of those cities, they had signed police union contracts that required the city to erase or purge or destroy the records of police misconduct. So across the board, from a data perspective, it is destroying the evidence. It is not reporting or tracking things that need to be tracked, all of which limits our ability as data scientists to better understand and advance data-driven solutions. That being said, I think that there are many things that we have more than enough data on to determine. We know that the police are receiving a whole lot of resources that ought to be redistributed to alternative responders. We know that nationwide, only about 5% of all arrests that are made are for violent crime. Only about 12% of all arrests that are made are for property crime. And the vast majority of arrests that are made are for low-level nonviolent offenses. And so this idea that the police are such an important and necessary institution to keep people safe, that is a myth. And when we look at the data, it's pretty clear that the vast majority of what police are doing, at best, is not in response to actually keeping people safe, and at worst is actually making people a lot less safe through the threat of police violence and racial profiling and discriminatory policing. So that's what we know. There's a whole bunch of data on 911 calls now that's being published in particular cities, and that shows that only about 1% to 2% of 911 calls involve a violent crime, and the vast majority of 911 calls can be diverted to an alternative agency to respond. The data that we have on police accountability, that shows that only about 1 in every 13 complaints of police misconduct nationwide results in any type of accountability. So if only one, and that's an officer getting disciplined at all. It could be a written reprimand or getting fired. So an even smaller proportion of those officers actually get removed from the force, which means that overall there's functionally very little to no accountability for police violence in this country. And that's what we know with the data. Now, diving deeper into the data requires having access to more comprehensive data, requires state legislation in many places to just compel police departments to report things that they refuse to report. So there's a whole infrastructure that needs to be built around tracking things, using data differently, using data to predict and intervene and stop police misconduct and police violence, and to inform the development and build of alternatives to the police. But we know enough to get that started.
Mm-hmm. And that legislative side of things is particularly interesting because there's different levels of sort of reluctance depending on which area you're in, obviously. In Oregon, Nkenge, you've seen these bills, the bills that were recently proposed. They seem to be in direct response to the protest movement and have the stated purpose of combating police violence, limiting the amount of violence the police can undertake. But it does, a lot of them do, at least to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, boil down to something along the lines of, an officer can't put a suspect in a chokehold unless they really want to. I'm being flippant, but really it's you have to declare a riot before you can use tear gas. Well, we declare a riot.
Omar, yeah, you're being flippant, and or at least you sound a little, but you're being honest. I mean, it's not flippant. That is absolutely true. So I'm happy to talk about just some of the. I mean, I'm interrupting you a little bit just to say you're right. What you're seeing is exactly what it is. Most of those proposals weren't new. First of all, they were drafted some time ago, and they weren't able to pass the Oregon state legislature at the time, right? So what happens in those situations? Usually that legislation has been watered down in an attempt to make it, palatable to folks who even, frankly, so-called progressive, so-called liberals, and certainly Democrats who are now singing a different tune here in July 2020 than they were singing, 2 years ago. But what we have said as community members is that, those don't go nearly far enough. The state legislature was welcome to call, to have that first session, but we're calling it a first special session. We expect that there will be a second special session, and perhaps a third, but certainly there will be more legislation in 2021 when we have the long session of the legislature that will go further than what we have seen now. Because you're right, what we now have, chokeholds were already banned, right? So what has happened now is that now statewide we've got something on the books that says police can't use chokeholds unless they want to. Tear gas, it's suddenly banned unless there's a riot. Well, who gets to declare riots, Omar? The police. And what have Portland police done every night since that law has been passed? They've declared a riot. Sometimes it's 11 p.m., sometimes it's 10:30. But they, tear gassed a bunch of moms and dads who were downtown protesting last night, and they did the same thing a couple of nights ago. They've been, tear gassing youth and homeless people, including those who have nothing to do with the riots, right? So the legislation that has been passed recently won't change that. Some of the things that Sam works on and has talked about, and in fact, some of Sam's work is informing the changes that we're seeking to make both in the city of Portland, but also statewide, go much further than what we've seen in Oregon to date. Mm-hmm. Is that what you're going to ask me if I'd let you finish?
You answered a much better question than I was going to ask, so thank you for that. I guess this gets to the heart of it, right? That, at least to me, and what I wouldn't mind spending the rest of our time on, which is this notion of, we talked about this a little earlier, this idea that there is a large contingent of this society, and it's a very siloed American experience where your interaction with an officer might be somebody who gives you a speeding ticket once a year, someone you might call after something bad has happened, and maybe they will do something about it after the fact. But when you talk about this idea of defunding, I've heard this response from people who immediately think, oh, the purge, oh, anarchy, oh, this notion of lawlessness. And, Sam, I've looked at some of the data you've done out of cities like Dallas, where it appears at least that half the discretionary budget goes to public safety, and the vast majority of that goes to policing, and the vast majority of that goes to officers' salaries. Nkenge, I'll start with you. Sam, I'll ask you this as well, but Nkenge, to start, in an ideal world, no political reluctance, what does defunding look like in a practical sense? What policies and what order would they be implemented in?
Ooh, I think I might save what order for Sam. So prepare yourself, Sam. But I think, for some people, it's easier if we talked about divest and invest. Mm-hmm. Let's think about what we'd like to invest in. We know that our Parks Department, there are hundreds of people who are not working in Portland Parks and Rec anymore this summer because of certainly the pandemic, but also because of money, right? Couldn't afford to have those folks in the job at a time when we need to have our parks, up and running, because people need to be able to be outside to some extent, certainly with their kids, if they're going to go for a walk, socially distanced, in order to stay safe. But instead we have fewer places for folks to go and be in the outside of doors. And we have fewer people who are on the job taking care of our special outdoor places. That's a real shame. What if we took a little bit of the police budget and paid the folks who run our parks instead? In fact, if we go into East Portland, there are very few parks in that part of our city. In fact, there are large swaths of our city that don't even have sidewalks to walk to a park, whether you're a kid or you're a senior citizen or you're an adult who wants to go walk their dog. There just aren't that many parks in East Portland. What if we took some of the police budget and we built parks in East Portland? Or let's think about our library. Our library has some really old buildings. Some of them are gorgeous, but they're also not functioning well, at least in Multnomah County and certainly in other parts of the state. So I don't, I can focus on Portland, but I'm also happy to talk about Salem and Eugene and just some other places that also suffer from these same issues, that we're spending too much money on police. Imagine if our library didn't have to have book sales and plant sales and bake sales in order to function as a library. Imagine if our library didn't have to charge late fees and fines. And, in fact, I think Multnomah County Library is shifting away from that model during the pandemic, but it's really tough for them. Well, what if we took a little bit of the police budget and used it to fund part of our libraries? Homeless services. Homelessness in Portland, in fact, in other parts of our state, is still growing. In cities like Salem, they are now confronting, our state capital are now confronting homelessness in a very real way, and it's difficult. It's also difficult in Monmouth. It's difficult in Woodburn and Silverton and some of our smaller communities that don't have the infrastructure that Portland has. Well, Portland hasn't yet answered the challenge of homelessness, of getting people inside of doors. And there are many, many working people who have incomes who still live outside of doors, because you can't live in Portland if you're making less than $22 an hour to afford a one-bedroom apartment. It's outrageous. So imagine if we just took a little bit of police budget to invest in affordable housing for families, for senior citizens, for working people. So when we talk about the things that we could invest in if we had the money, people get excited about that. Oh, I'd love to do that. Talk about schools. How much more money could we spend on schools or after school programs or before school care for working parents who need to drop a kid off? All of these things, and I could go on, the COVID pandemic, right? All the testing that's not happening, all the free clinics that aren't set up around our state and around our communities. Well, if we took some of that police budget money, we could get Oregonians tested and get them tested quicker and know and know what their results are. And then we could help them once they find out their results, so they don't have to go back into the same workplaces where they infect the rest of their coworkers, simply because they have to have a paycheck to keep a roof over their head and feed their families. Just imagine what our community could look like with just a little more money. Well, the police department is sitting on pots and pots of that money. So when we look at it in those terms, Omar, I think it becomes easier for people to understand, and whatever order we go in. And there is a sense of that we can certainly talk more about that. I said, Sam, that I would put you on the spot about that, but homelessness, some of the examples I just gave you, right? Education, services for homeless people, addiction, and mental health services. Oregon has one of the highest rates of addiction in the country. I think we were at number 7, right? Compared to the other states in the union when last I checked. We're 4th from the bottom for states when it comes to offering addiction and mental health services. So really high addiction rates and really low treatment rates. Well, if we look at the records, we know that Portland police, what they spend most of their time doing is arresting homeless people. And it's catch and release, because they got nowhere to go and they're being arrested for, defecating on the street because there's no bathroom for them to go to. What if we built some public bathrooms and maintained them? Wouldn't that take care of that issue so they could stop catching and releasing? What if we got folks housed? Then they could use their own bathrooms in their own homes. The other thing that Portland police, not just from Portland, all over our state actually, spend a lot of time doing is interacting with folks who have addiction issues, whether it's because of DUIs, whether it's because of folks, public drunkenness, fights. My husband's does some public defense work, and a majority of the clients that he interacts with were high or drunk, under the influence of some substance, and many of them have addiction issues. And there's nowhere to go for treatment. So they're just running through the system and running through the system and running through the system. What if we actually invested in ending that cycle? Well, we could do that if we weren't spending so much darn money on the police department. That's the way that I like to frame it for people, because when they think about what they get out of the bargain, then it's easier for them to understand. At least that's the way that I see it. What do you think, Sam?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And on the, like, how do we cut the police budget to get their side of things? I think that there are a set of areas within the police budget that make a lot of sense to start cutting right away while we work towards cutting a lot more of the budget over time, right? Just recognizing that politically, because this has been challenging in many places, in order to build sort of the political support, the political will to implement some of these cuts. It's important to be able to link the cuts to the specific things that we know are so problematic, are at the root of this. So for example, and this is like an exercise that I did for Dallas as well, which I think you talked about, Omar. So this is, first of all, what are the units that are making all of these arrests for low-level offenses across the city? It tends to be narcotics and vice. Narcotics unit arrests people for drug offenses. Vice tends to arrest people for sex work, both of which should be decriminalized. So we should defund those units right away. Like that line item, you look at how much money is going to those units, cut them. Similarly, the department itself is already in Portland and across the state, and indeed across the country, departments already are staffed with a huge number of officers and a huge amount of resources for the overall general fund of a city. So there should be a hiring freeze, right? We should be not bringing on more and more and more officers to continue to expand the police force. In fact, we should be cutting that. So implement a hiring freeze, cut the recruiting department in the police department because they won't have much work to do if there's no hiring. And redistribute those funds into community-based alternatives and resources. Similarly, there are units that are highly militarized, that are often responsible for so much of the police violence that we're seeing, the police violence against protesters, the police violence against folks in no-knock raids and other raids that are happening across the country, tends to be the SWAT units. So defund the SWAT units, cut their funding, cut that money for militarized equipment, redistribute that money into communities. Similarly, the department, so the city of Portland, the Portland Police Bureau, they have access to all the data needed to identify which officers have the biggest records of misconduct, which officers have the biggest racial disparities in who they're stopping and arresting, which officers use the most force. All of those things they can identify, which officers have the most complaints against them for misconduct, who have the most lawsuits against them. It turns out that within, when you look at the data, policing as an institution is problematic. And in addition to that, there are a set of officers within each department that tend to be responsible for an even higher rate of violence and misconduct than other officers. The department knows who they are, the data is there. Those should be the officers that are removed from the force first, right? If we are cutting the size of the police force, it ought to happen prioritizing those officers who have the biggest records of misconduct to be removed from the force first. So again, there are a set of things that we can use data to inform, that we can use an analysis of where are these low-level arrests coming from, who's doing those arrests, which units, which divisions are responsible for the pattern and practice of discriminatory policing and police violence that we're seeing, and then focus in on defunding those areas of the department, shifting those resources as we work towards sort of a broader transformative vision around safety in general. And so I think that there's a pathway to get there. I think there are some cities that are sort of experimenting now with particular components of this. So, even in Oregon, you look at Eugene and the Cahoots program, 1 in 5 calls for service, they have mental health providers now instead of police responding to. That's a model that could be implemented. That would take away so many of or remove or prevent many of these encounters that escalate to the police arresting people and using force against people and even killing people.
Similarly, will you say that stat again? Will you say the Eugene stat again? I want to make sure that everybody heard that. Yeah,
so it's about 1 in every 5 calls for service, 911 calls now. They have a mental health provider, an unarmed first responders, a mental health provider responding to the scene instead of the police. Similarly, we're seeing in Berkeley right now, the city council just passed legislation to create a Department of Transportation within the city that would have unarmed civil servants who are the ones who would now be doing traffic enforcement instead of the police in the city. So when you look at the data, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics' most recent survey, they found that there are about 30 million police-initiated stops nationwide. About 30 million people are stopped. And of that, about 24 million of those stops are traffic stops, both drivers and pedestrians that they're stopping the police in traffic stops. And so that's the vast majority of overall police-initiated stops are traffic stops. And so why don't we just remove police from the equation for that entirely and do what Berkeley is doing, which is you don't need somebody with a gun to be stopping somebody for driving 3 miles over the speed limit. You don't need somebody with a gun to be intervening if somebody has a broken taillight, or if somebody has a car accident. There's no reason for somebody with a gun to be responding to the scene for a car accident. So there are so many different activities that the police are currently responding to, that they're being resourced to respond to, that they have no business being involved in at all, and that we can use data to very strategically make the case for cutting those functions from the police department and redistributing and shifting those resources to the agencies and to the responders and to the community-based organizations that can do a far better job at responding to these situations and do it in a way that doesn't result in violence.
Omar, can I say that one of the challenges that we have at the Urban League of Portland is, so first, most of my staff are people of color. Most are African American. Most of our clients, not all, but most are also African American. And when, on the rare occasion when there's an incident in our building, we've had occasions where someone pulled a small knife. We've had an occasion where someone was clearly having a mental health challenges that were causing them to act out and be rather violent. My staff is on 2 different occasions, and we probably need to revisit the issue now, even though we're working remotely for the most part. But on 2 different occasions, 2 different years, my staff has said, you know what, we won't be calling the police even when we feel like there's a situation where other folks might call the police. First, because they know it makes it dangerous for them, right? For the employees who would call the phone, it's not a good idea to have armed officers show up at our building because all of us are Black, quite frankly, and they'll be looking for the bad guy, and all of us look like bad guys to too many police officers. Worse than that, our clients aren't bad guys. So even if one has a knife and it's scary, as the boss, this is scary for me to think about and to say. My staff have said, we would rather use our skills and our training to try to de-escalate the situation. If we can, we'd rather isolate ourselves, behind, locked, doors until the person leaves. We'd rather have all the office come out and, so we have 15, 20 people standing in the lobby trying to, diffuse the situation, or at least, keep each other safe. They have these other steps they'd like to take rather than calling the Portland police. So think about what that means. At least in my case, I've got people who are trained much like the folks in Eugene at Cahoots. We've got an outreach team that works out on the streets, engaging with people and trying to get people services. And we're really successful at that work. But those same folks say, I can't turn around and call the cops because I know they're just as likely to make things worse as they are to intervene in a way that doesn't make things worse. Please notice I didn't say they'll make things better, because that's not what police do. They may arrest this person, they may add to their record, they may, incarcerate them, they may do a number of different things, but what they're not going to do is to make the situation better. They're not going to make that citizen's life better. They're not going to make the Urban League situation better. In general, that's not going to happen. For me, that's a huge challenge as a boss, because we're a community-based organization, but it's also a business and their employees for whom I'm responsible. I think if we look at the other side of the river, we know downtown there are a number of businesses who call the police like that. In fact, they want the police out front all the time, doing sweeps of the sidewalk and keeping people, non-customers away from their doors. It's a very different reality for those folks. And I wanted to mention that because often you'll hear members of elected officials saying, well, businesses want this and businesses want that. Well, I run a business. We got a pretty nice sized budget to serve people. And the police don't serve us in that way. I just wanted to, something Sam said made me think about that. And I wanted to share it because I think it's an example that we don't hear enough about, even as folks are extolling virtues and the need for more police officers in Portland.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the things I'm thinking about is this idea that, the investment and divestment, as you put it, which I think is a really wonderful way to frame it, the investments you've talked about, the divestments you've talked about, there's no doubt in my mind that if that were implemented tomorrow and we had a 5-year span of looking at the effects of this, that you would see virtually every negative indicator go down. But I also think that the first time that that unarmed traffic officer pulls over somebody and that somebody has a gun and shoots them, because this is a country with the most guns, the most individual guns in the world, that there will be an onslaught of calls by every police union in this country, every Republican politician, a lot of Democratic politicians, to shift back towards the old way of doing things because look at what happened. And so I'm more asking, just as folks who deal with this day in, day out, does it change your approach at all, being cognizant of this higher threshold to which your vision of the way things should be is being held, that the first time something goes wrong under the system, there will be an immense call for going back to having armed police respond to virtually everything, because who knows what's going to happen on the other side of that encounter?
Yeah, for me, it doesn't heighten my concern or the response. It does, we include that in our planning and our thought process, Omar, because of course that's going to be an objection, but it can be an objection about any field, right? Right, and I haven't looked in a while, but when I last checked, being a police officer wasn't the most dangerous career in the country. It wasn't even in the top half of the most dangerous careers in the country. It was more dangerous to be a recycling and trash hauler. That was more dangerous to be a firefighter. Well, the nice folks who pick up my recycling don't come packing. Even if other people on my blocks have guns, that's not something that happens, right? We don't listen to teachers when they talk about what it means to them and their fear and concern about guns, but we've had teachers, right, who have been shot and killed in the workplace. And now some people talk about arming teachers, but most of us think that that is crazy and a terrible idea and no one's rushing to do it. So police officers have this special status in society that the rest of us don't get to have. Doctors don't get to have it, and they are victims of violence pretty frequently. Nurses are certainly victims of violence pretty regularly. Ask the nurses union. They don't get that special status. We're not talking about arming nurses. And I could go on and on down the line. When fires show up, they are either in EMT mode, so EMTs that come with the fire brigade, or they're showing up with hoses and axes to try to save people. Even though firefighters have been shot at and at least on one occasion I recall killed in the course of their regular firefighting duties. We didn't then say we need to start having firefighters, pack arms. So it's a disingenuous argument, and I don't like to spend a lot of time on those. And I while they will arise, I don't think honest brokers have a leg to stand on. Should they attempt to raise such issues, it would make them not, frankly, honest brokers anymore.
Mm-hmm. Samuel, sorry, I wanted to ask you about this idea of the intersection of what it means to be an honest broker versus the amount of institutional power that you run up against. I was looking at the Dallas statistics, and there was one officer who appeared to have something like 25 times the number of use of force incidents than the average officer. Once every 2 weeks, this person was involved in one of these. But there are immense protections, right? There's union protections, but there's also sort of wider legal protections in terms of seizure, forfeiture, body cam video, what happens immediately after an altercation, how much time the officer has to get their story straight, who they can consult with, all of that. Can you give me a sense of just sort of what the institutional barriers are to getting this kind of change done? What kind of power you're up against?
Yeah, so the largest and most well-organized and resourced interest group that you're up against for making any change at all, changes to policy, changes to the police budget, changes to the accountability structure, changes to state law. The biggest group that you're up against are the police unions. Consistently, every single time. You'll have cities where the police unions will block even the police chief from doing anything. And what the police chief wants to do isn't even half or even a quarter of what the community wants, right? And so that is just to name, that is actually the group. If there was one group that has blocked everything from happening, that is the group, right? It is not even the police chiefs. It's not even necessarily the mayor, although, in Portland, I think the mayor definitely has a number of demerits and has been involved in some nefarious ways. But I think overall, it's been the police unions across the country as an organized interest group that have blocked anything from happening. And they exercise that power in a variety of ways. So one is putting in place these statewide law enforcement officer Bill of Rights laws in states like Oregon and in 15 states across the country that create special protections for officers who are under investigation for misconduct. That law is designed to create special protections that make it more difficult to fire or discipline officers who have been accused of misconduct. That is what the law does. That is in place in Oregon. It's in place in 15 states. Georgia, in the midst of the protest, actually became the 16th state to adopt one of these laws. And that is one way. The second way is local police union contracts. So every 3 to 4 years, your city will renegotiate a police union contract with the police union. And that usually happens behind closed doors in a secretive process where the city essentially bargains away any power that it has to actually hold officers accountable. And once those things are baked into these contracts, the police union then has veto power over any changes to the contract because both parties have to sign off on any changes to the contract. So what does that mean? That means in Portland, there's one clause in that contract in Portland, the arbitration clause, that has been responsible for reinstating every officer that has been fired for deadly force over the past several years. In Portland as well, there is a clause in the contract that prohibits the department's early warning system, which was built to identify officers that have those records of misconduct and intervene before they shoot or kill somebody. It prohibits that system from being used to discipline officers. There's another provision in that contract that requires, if you discipline an officer, the discipline has to happen in a way, the contract says, least likely to embarrass the officer in front of the public or other officers. So I don't even know what that means, least likely to, like none of us get that protection at our jobs, first of all. Second of all, there are officers that have committed egregious misconduct in Portland that have been fired or disciplined for it and then been able to reverse that decision, get reinstated plus back pay because they felt like they were embarrassed by being called out for egregious acts of misconduct. So again, this is systemic, this is structural. This isn't about the police chief or the mayor or the city council or your state legislators. This is a system that's in place where regardless of whether the police chief wants to fire the officer, you could get the police chief that actually wants to fire the officer. They could try to fire the officer and that officer is getting reinstated through a process called arbitration because of the police union contract and because of state law that allows officers to appeal any disciplinary decision to arbitrators who are essentially a lawyer that is selected by both the city and the police union that has full authority to review the case and reinstate those officers plus back pay. And there's nothing the city can do about it. So, you know, the police chief wanted that officer gone. Yeah, so
what I mean by that is, so even if the police chief is successful in firing a police officer, right? What you talked about earlier in terms of records and tracking and tracing, that police officer can go across the street. So leave Portland Police Bureau and go to Multnomah County Sheriff. In fact, the sheriff used to be a Portland police officer. In other parts of our state, it happens pretty regularly. You'll have a police officer in a city and something doesn't go right, or there's a complaint or whatever, they will walk out of the door on Monday and start another job on Tuesday as a police officer in the exact same community, because that's just the way it goes, regardless of how terrible their record was at the previous policing agency. I saw that happen in on the South Coast just last year. And people don't know that because who's paying that much attention to, you know, police officer chess, but the police know it. And even if it's not the one community over, we just had an assistant chief in Portland went down to be the police chief in Bend. The folks in Bend don't get the benefit of knowing what that officer's record was while he was in Portland. So they think they could be, you know, getting someone great, but maybe they're buying a lemon, but they don't have any way of knowing that because the police contracts are so good that those records get destroyed, they can't be shared, et cetera, and so forth.
Yep,
Thanks for letting me interrupt you, Sam.
Either the officer gets rehired at their own department through being reinstated by the arbitrator, or if they're fired and they don't get reinstated, they just go on to the next department, they get a job there, and they're still policing communities. So the other thing that's important about this is, you know, that affects the accountability process, the contract structure, the system for investigating and disciplining officers for misconduct. the contract and the police unions also structure the conversation about the police budget and alternatives to the police. So this isn't just about, the accountability process and the systems within the police department. It's also about the ability of cities to chart a new direction and to divest from policing and invest in alternatives. So in Portland right now, there has been a lot of conversation around expanding the street response unit or the street response team. And these are folks who respond to issues of mental health and homelessness in the city, who are not armed police officers responding to the scene, but an alternative response that is supposed to protect folks and not expose them to police violence. But in expanding that, the police union has said, if you go beyond 5 units of the street response team, then that suddenly becomes subject to bargaining, subject to negotiation with the police union, which means that if you want to build an alternative to the police, suddenly the police unions are asserting the power through these contracts to actually have veto power over any type of change, any type of alternative you want to build, any type of reduction to the budget. So you look at Louisville, where the police killed Breonna Taylor, the police union contract in Louisville says there shall be no layoffs of officers during the term of this agreement, which means you really can't cut the size of the police force. Similarly, what many of these contracts say is they establish automatic increases to officer pay, benefits, and salary. So when you look at a police budget, the average police budget is 85% officer pay, benefits, and overtime. And so if you have a contract that automatically increases that every single year and prohibits any layoffs, literally you will only increase the police budget regardless of anything else that you do from now until that contract is changed. The only thing that you can do to meaningfully cut that budget in those cities is to change the contract. And then we can talk about how to actually work outside the contract to cut the budget. So literally, this is so important to all of the conversations that we're having, is to connect it back to the structural and systemic issues that have to change if we want to build a better tomorrow, if we want to divest from policing, invest in alternatives, if we want police officers who commit misconduct to be held accountable. All of those things mean we have to take on the police unions. We have to take on these contracts. We have to take on statewide police Bill of Rights laws. We have to stop the police unions from buying politicians and buying elections. All of those are a part of what has to happen in this moment.
Omar, one of the things that I think people need to understand is right now when they're looking at downtown Portland and they're seeing police officers out there, and I don't want to talk about the feds because they need to go home. And the police were just as bad as the feds. Now there's just more jackbooted thugs, frankly, on our streets. So there's no need to really differentiate. But the police are making overtime, right? There was the 1 day, the 1.5 days where the mayor and the U.S. attorney for Oregon asked the governor to bring in the National Guard. It was a terrible idea, and many of us asked the governor to say no, but she was in a difficult position, I understand. But we also asked the mayor to say no, don't do this. But their argument was, listen, we've already called in state troopers. We've already borrowed, police assistance from neighboring jurisdictions. And now our police officers are tired. They've been working, too many hours. And a sleepy cop is a dangerous cop. That's just facts, right? So understand all of that. So we need to bring in the National Guard so that we can get some rest for the officers who are on the front line. Okay, it's still a terrible idea, but they did it. Now, here we are on day 54 of protests in Portland. That's a whole lot of time, but it also means that there are a whole lot of many police officers who are making overtime. Every night, every day, there are overtime shifts going on. Every night, every day, for the past 54 days. I don't know about you, but I remember when I used to make OT. I know what those dollars are like, and I wasn't sad about it. Oh, we got to do inventory in the shop? Great, count me in. That's time and a half right there. Oh, we got to work this holiday. You know what? I can do Christmas on the 26th. I'll be there on the 25th because that's double. When throw in some more OT, I'll take it. Now, and I don't mean this to disparage folks who aren't worthy of it, but some people aren't really unhappy about having to work these protests. Some officers don't have any incentive, frankly, to try to keep them nonviolent, because the more they escalate, the more they get paid. Every time they call a riot, that means more officers got to be out there on the street. Every time they deploy tear gas and are out there arresting people, that means there's got to be more people back there who are going to be processing those arrestees. That's just money in the bank. So at a time when we've got public employees in the city of Portland and other cities across our state who are furloughed, who are not working, even members of our city council, elected officials are taking furlough days, right? Not working and not getting paid because our city budget can't afford it. We're paying cops tons of money. And it's gonna break our hearts when we see what those dollars are like, because we could have used it to house people. We could have used it to help people get through this pandemic. And instead we're using it to pay OT to police officers who are disincentivized from trying to bring, to be peaceful. I wanted to mention that because I think that some people don't run that math, but it's certainly an important part of what we're seeing in our streets every night.
Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of what you both brought up has to do with this sort of intersection, for lack of a better analogy, between the faucet and the well, just to say the individual motivations and the systemic stuff. When a cop kills someone in this country, there is an immense effort sometimes, as there should be all of the time, to hold this cop accountable. And oftentimes that goes nowhere, but it is an effort to change the faucet because the faucet is rotten. But so long as the well is poisoned, it doesn't matter how many faucets you change, the water is still poisoned. And so when you're talking about these systemic issues, I think, and often you've brought this up, both of you, the clauses in contracts, you're talking about provisions within contracts or dense legal documents that I would imagine many citizens not only don't read, but feel no consequences if they don't pay attention to. And we opened this to questions earlier from the audience. And one of the questions that kept coming up was this idea of what can I as an individual do? We got multiple variants of that question. One of those variants was, I am a white person who doesn't feel much impact by ignoring this. What can I do? And we got one saying, I've been at home because of COVID. I've been locked down for 4 months. What can I do? And so that's what I want to close with. To both of you, Nkenge, we'll start with you. What can the average individual do in the face of what is both an individual and a systemic issue that encompasses so much of the society we live in?
I know we've got folks watching in DC and Chicago and different parts of Oregon. So hi all. No matter where you are, you can speak up. You can, and I'll use Portland as the example. If you're one of those white folks who can, ignore the police, they don't interact with you at all on a regular basis, it doesn't impact you, but you want it to be different, then call the mayor and tell him so. But don't stop at the mayor, call your attorney general and tell her so too. And then call your US attorney and tell the US attorney, listen, I want you to investigate police officers in Portland who are stepping on the civil rights of people in our city. Tell the district attorney, the incoming district attorney in Portland, that you want to see something done about bad cops. But don't stop there. Call a DA in Clackamas County. Call the DA over in Washington County. It's a Portland metro region. And I mean physically pick up the phone and make a call because they hear from me all the time, right? I run the Urban League. They see me coming a mile away and they expect me to be saying the things that I'm saying. But when it comes from some other folks, from the people whose votes they're really going to be seeking, from those campaign check signers, they listen differently. The same is true when it comes to our legislators and our governor. Pick up the phone, grab your pen, write a letter, whether it's a letter to the editor or a letter to those offices, and let them know that you care about this and you want it to be different. Even those acts will help, because oftentimes what I hear from the mayor, what I hear from other electeds is, well, I know you're saying this, Nkenge, but I just heard from a bunch of folks in the West Hills that they like things just the way they are. Now, I don't think that's true, but the people who are wondering what they can do, you can prove that it's not true. You can demonstrate that you want things to be different too. What else you can do is support those organizations and those people who are stepping out and standing up on these issues. I always invite people to join the Urban League. We're at ulpdx.org. All are welcome. This is the kind of work that we do every single day. We employ people, we train people how to work on these issues and talk about them and get out there and organize to make a difference. We'd love to have your support, but there are many others in our community that do this work too. Become a member and send $5, send $50, send $5,000 to help fund this work, because we're up against very well-funded police unions. We're up against very well-funded chambers of commerce. And let me tell you, they're not going to stop coming, so we can't stop coming. So there's something that all of us can do. Pick it up right now. And for those people who feel like, I can, I've been inside and I would like to go outside, grab your mask, grab your hand sanitizer, grab your face shield, go out there. and join a protest, whether it's a family protest during the day and it's a little bit, sort of lower octane, or it's out there in the evenings and you want to join those protests. It's okay to do that. It's our right. It's our country. It's our city. You don't have to wait to be invited, but if you thought you did, I hereby invite you. Welcome. Join the movement.
So the only thing I'll add, that because that was so perfect, is the police union specifically, because that's just been an area that for the past 5 years, we've been tracking the police union contracts in 81 of the 100 largest cities in the country. We've been reviewing the contracts, seeing how they impact accountability, seeing how they impact the budget, seeing the statewide police bill of rights laws. And I think what is clear is that if we don't fight on the union contract front, the police union contract front, so much of the other things that we care about, that we want to see, some of the changes we want to see happen, will not be able to be done because it will be blocked by that contract or blocked by that police bill of rights law. And so if you want to make progress on those issues, one thing you can do is go to checkthepolice.org. That's where you can find out for those 81 cities how your city's police union contract impacts police accountability. You can see whether your city's currently negotiating its contract. So Portland is currently negotiating the police union contract. So this is actually a critical period if you're in a city that's negotiating its contract, which tends to happen about a year before the contract expires and goes through that process. That this is a key moment to influence your city council, your mayor, to reject any contract that has language that obstructs accountability, any contract that will negatively impact the ability of the city to cut the police budget. So all of those things can be done. They can especially be done during these negotiation periods. So find out if your city is currently negotiating its police union contract. Get involved in contacting your mayor, your city council, organizing locally to put a lot of pressure on them to take action. And we've seen this happen. We've seen this work in places like Austin, Texas, or even Spokane in Washington. We've seen communities put a lot of pressure on the city and actually successfully get the city to reject a police union contract. In Austin, they got many of those provisions that obstruct investigations into police misconduct removed from the contract, in addition to winning $40 million that then they were able to cut from the police budget and reinvest into communities through that contract negotiation process. So this is a critical process to be involved in. It can sound sort of wonky or in the weeds to talk about police union contracts, but this is actually a core process that we have to be at the table on, we have to be involved in, we have to be contacting our local officials about if we want to make the types of changes that need to happen in this moment.
Thank you both so much for this. Before we go, I want to tell all of our viewers we're going to be having those breakout sessions after this. Please join them. I imagine there's a lot of really interesting conversation that's going to be prompted by what these two excellent panelists have said over the last hour. And finally, I just want to thank everyone for showing up to this. And I especially want to thank you, Nkenge and Samuel, for not only everything you've said over the last hour, but just the work that you do. I was a journalist in a previous life, but for the past few years, I make stuff up for a living. I write novels. And because a few years ago, I wrote a novel that is, spoiler alert, a stone cold bummer, I get asked a lot, where's the hope? And the hope is in the work that you do. I know, at least from my perspective, it feels sometimes like positive change takes years and negative change happens overnight. And it's quite often thankless and difficult. And I think I speak on behalf of everyone watching by saying thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Omar. Glad to do it. Sam, I appreciate you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I appreciate you too, Nkenge, and Omar as well. Thanks for this moment. And anyone who wants to reach out, I'm at sam@thisisthemovement.org. I'm happy to dive into any of these issues and support whatever you need.